Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, a proposed bill in Canada aims to rid the country of what it calls barbaric cultural practices. We'll tell you what it's about and why it's angered many. So this is a story that we first saw online. Our digital producer Malika Bilal, tell us more.
Well, as you know, we covered it in a web piece online. I pulled that up on my screen here, and we got so much commentary on it, we decided to turn it into a show. Much of that commentary revolved around the name of the bill itself, Barbaric. Got a lot of people talking, and we want you talking at home as well. You can join this conversation with hashtag AJStream. And
joining us here in the studio, we have ARUNA PAPP, and ARUNA is an educator and advocate for women's rights. She's also author of Unworthy Creature, a Punjabi daughter's memoir of honour, shame and love. ARUNA, it's great to have you here in the stream.
Well, thank you.
And we'll hear more from you in just a moment.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Todd Bottom from DePaul University. I'm a father, a husband, and I'm in the stream.
Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. That's the name of new legislation introduced into Canada's Parliament that aims to end polygamy and forced marriages. Citizenship and Immigration Minister Chris Alexander announced the bill earlier this month. It was widely covered in Canadian media and has divided opinion.
With the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, we intend on sending a very clear message to anyone coming to Canada that such practices are unacceptable.
So under the bill, those in polygamous or forced marriages would be disqualified from immigrating to the country, and it could mean deportation for those already in Canada. The controversial bill has been met with criticism, with many saying its only purpose is to marginalise immigrants and target Muslims. Joining us to discuss this via Skype in Toronto, we have FARRAH Khan, a public speaker and educator on violence against women, including forced marriage and so-called honour-related violence. And in Montreal, freelance writer and editor Tula Drimonis. So it's good to have you all here in the stream, everybody. We actually spoke to Chris Alexander. He's the Citizen and Immigration Minister. We contacted his office, and this is what he sent us. We were wondering, what is the state of immigrants community in Canada right now that we'd even have to have a bill like this? And he says in a 2013 report by the South Asian Legal Clinic found that 219 reported cases of forced marriage in Ontario between 2010 and 2012. 92% were female, 30% were only teenagers. And then he goes on to say that there have been approximately 25 criminal cases of honour killings since 1995, 21 of these cases in the last decade. So ARUNA, just to get us this sense of forced marriage, how do you force someone into a marriage?
Well, there are several ways of doing that. First of all, one of the groups that we have not paid attention to is women who are divorced by their husbands, and then their families force them to marry somebody else. And they may have 2 children, 3 children, or they may, just because they're divorced, they end up marrying older men from the old country for immigration. So that is one group that we have not paid attention to.
And these are women living in Canada right now.
These are women living in Canada. So it becomes very much like human trafficking, and marrying them from one to the other. So that overplays there as well. The other group that we have not paid attention to very much is gay men, for example. They are forced into marriages as well. The larger group is younger girls who are in high schools and colleges, universities, who are being forced to marry men they have never met. 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls are taken into the old country and married. And
so let's break this down. Give us a scenario where, obviously you don't want to name names, but give us a situation where you know this actually happened. So taken to the old country means taken to India, taken to Afghanistan, what?
There are hundreds of cases over the 30 years that I've been working in this field, and one of those cases was very desperate that I didn't know how to help her. A young girl who was a medical student, a nursing student, who was just coming out of, and there are so many cases and it's hard to pick one, coming out of her training and talking to a male colleague, and one of the people who was a taxi driver started to follow her and photograph her. And every time he photographed her sitting with a male colleague and took the picture to the uncle, the older gentleman in the family, and this girl was told that she is going to the old country to a family wedding. Nobody told her it was her wedding. The only reason was that she was having a lunch with a male person and a man who was her friend.
So that was seen to be what?
That she was sexually involved with this person, and it may be her boyfriend. Nobody asked her.
So the forced marriage was as a punishment for behaving in that way?
In that way. And luckily for her, the person she was chosen to marry was her first cousin, who was in love with somebody else. And he said, I will try and help you get away from the elders. And both of them were punished, and both of them, and it's a horrendous 3-year story. By the time I got to her, there was very little I could do. I put her in my car and drove her to Ottawa and told the Minister for the Citizenship, for the Women status, that you look after this woman, because this is happening far too much. And stories, I mean, I could write a huge book about stories, because it's very common. I speak at different churches and events. I had 17 teachers waiting in the parking lot 2 months ago. In the parking lot, I said, why are you waiting in the dark? We don't want to be recognized. We want you to know what's happening in the school. They refuse to talk to girls who they think might be victims of honor-based violence, forced marriages, because they don't know what to do. So that, to me, is unacceptable. The first avenue for a young girl to get help is the teacher. And so the teachers are refusing to talk to the young girls.
Because
why? That's unacceptable.
Why would the teachers refuse?
They don't know what to do. They are scared. They are not trained. They haven't got information for them and things like that. They need to be told what is honor-based violence. Just normal discipline from parents is not honor-based violence. It's not child abuse, right? Well, all of us have teenagers and we discipline our children, but it isn't leading to forced marriages.
Okay, ARUNA,
so
take
there's
a breath.
A difference.
Take a breath for a moment, because you bring up a lot of different things, and we have a lot of guests and a lot of community who want to get in. Malika, you go first.
Well, ARUNA gave us examples of forced marriage, and it's examples like those that lead to tweets like this. Brad says, this is a good move. This legislation is supporting the defenseless, the tragic girls caught up in this outdated practice. So FARRAH, you know, you heard ARUNA talk about forced marriages. Can you describe for us what some of these other quote-unquote outdated practices might be?
Well, I first want to just clarify, Chris Alexander showed the report from the South Asian Legal Clinic, which spoke about forced marriage in Canada. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating about that report was actually that in the report, of the 200 so cases that came about, 44% of them that were affected were Canadian citizens. So they're not immigrants. And so I think that's a really important piece of your we're missing from this conversation. And so I think that is a conversation, one. And two, when people are talking about family violence, I think ARUNA and I agree on some things. And one thing we do agree on is that there needs to be more conversation. I think violence against women is very constructed sometimes in a way that we only talk about rape and sexual assault. We talk about domestic violence as in a partner hurting their partner, or we talk about child sexual abuse or physical assault of children. But the problem is that we miss out on a whole population of the 16 up that experience family violence, and that can be from any culture and any community. And we can't when we make it kind of this thing that happens by those people over there, we lose out on actually making sure that young women in Canada who are experiencing family violence from all communities actually get the support that they need.
So FARRAH, this is a critique then of the legislation or the proposed legislation, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Like this legislation isn't going to support women. Yeah, sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I think this legislation in of itself is not actually addressing what we need to address by the government. The government needs to actually have a violence against women strategy. We need to address the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. There's over 1,000 in Canada that have been missing and murdered. We have Rita Parsons. Just last week, she was a 15-year-old girl who was raped at a party, and the young man who took photographs of her being raped and put a thumbs up in those photographs wasn't charged. So how do young girls know in any situation they experience violence that they can get support? We are not supporting survivors in Canada. We cannot make this an immigrant issue. This is a Canadian issue.
Right. All right. So you've reframed the conversation. Is there enough in terms of stories, though, in terms of cases within the community where you could see why the legislation would actually be proposed in the first place? It particularly looks at forced marriage, polygamous marriage, as well as gender-based violence. It's a very specific look at, at things. Even though you're broadening it out and saying, well, Canada has a greater issue here, it starts with a specific place. Are there enough stories there for that legislation to be worthwhile?
I think it's actually kind of the government stepping away from actually being accountable to the fact that violence is happening in Canada so much. We know that there's been a law against polygamy in Canada since 1892. And that's included in our immigration law and policy. So it's kind of interesting that this law came about. Interesting is a very specific word, that this law has come about in the way that it has, because it actually is targeting a very small amount. And actually, even the amount of people that Chris Alexander said had been killed during honor killings, there's been other studies that have said the opposite. There's been 13. So we have to know that in Canada, every 6 to 7 days, a woman is killed by their partner, murdered by a domestic partner or someone they've left. Whereas there's been 13 so-called honor killings in Canada since 1999 that have been documented. So I just think that, like, for me, if my government is so interested in ending violence against women, then this is the focus that they should have. And I think they're targeting a very small community in this. And I also, when you say community, what community do you mean by that?
All right.
I think there are a couple of things that I want to respond to, and that is, yes, Farrah and I agree on many things, and we do disagree on several things. And one of the things is, if you go on my website, you will find name of 24 people who have been killed by honor-based violence. So they are documented on a case, but whether we recognize them or not, or who recognizes them, is a different issue. And I do agree that Aboriginal women have needs, and we need to focus on them and look after them, but also their community needs to take care of what is happening within their community. But for South Asians and for those whom this bill is, it is our responsibility, not just government's responsibility, to look after women. It is the responsibility of our people, all of us, all Canadians, regardless of color. But within the South Asian community, and I work with the South Asian community,
you feel a special responsibility, Aruna?
I feel special responsibility.
What do we mean by... Sorry, Aruna, I don't understand.
Whether they are citizens like me here for 40 years, or whether they are new immigrants, we are all Canadians, and
yes,
we
and so
bring
people. Indigenous women are asking, some Indigenous women are asking for Indigenous women to be heard,
and they should be helped
and believed.
Absolutely.
Well, they can help themselves, and they're asking for
absolutely.
that. And
I agree with you.
Aruna, just let me finish. So, and Ashley, and with South Asian communities members, and the South Asian Legal Clinic did the first study in Canada that was groundbreaking on this issue.
Absolutely.
And they said in that report that survivors said, do not criminalize this. We need time to do education in the community. We have not done that. If we look at the UK model, they did at least 10 years of doing deep education in the community. If you're saying you want this to be community-based, then we actually have to create time for community members to do that work. And communities there is some groundbreaking work done in Canada about this issue.
I agree.
And so we need this actually to be the way to move forward.
Okay.
To criminalize things right away is not going to help.
Okay,
exactly.
ladies,
Can I just jump in as well?
Ladies, just take a pause for a moment. Tula, I hear you. I just want to get the community in, then I'll come right back to you. Malika.
Well, there is a point that Aruna mentioned, that it's not just the government's responsibility, and we have a response to that on Twitter. Cyrus says, you have to accept that violence against women crosses cultures. Harper's government, Prime Minister, has slashed funding for women's rights organizing and women's shelters. It's hypocritical. So this person is saying that the government is not doing enough as it is. And Tula, I know you wanted to get in, and I wanted to reference this because this is really echoing some of the criticisms that we heard earlier from Farrah. Indu says, obviously, polygamy and honor killings are unacceptable, but violence against women is a bigger problem than just in minority communities. She goes on to say its cultural focus is racist. Tula?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is my biggest problem with this bill. It is grandstanding. It's basically the government is vote pandering at this point. We don't need, as women, dealing with a lot of issues affecting our, our safety and our health. We don't need slogans from the government. We need actual solutions. And coming out with a bill that is named Zero Tolerance for cultural barbaric practices, to me, is very ethnocentric. It is it's moralizing. It's basically coming from this place of, you know, we're morally superior here, and we're supposed to teach those coming in, the newly arrived immigrants, how it's supposed to be done. And it's completely ignoring the reality of women's reality here in Canada. As earlier, as FARRAH mentioned, you know, every 6 days a woman is murdered by her partner here. The plight of the Aboriginal missing and murdered women. The fact that there are about 460,000 sexual assaults that take place in women here. How are we supposed to forget that? And I understand what ARUNA is trying to say, and I can empathize with her own personal experience. At the same time, though, what do we need a bill that is grandstanding when there's already legislation in place against these things? Polygamy is already illegal in this country. Forced marriages are illegal in this country. Underage marriage is illegal in this country. The funny thing is, when Minister Alexander was coming out with this bill and he gave the press conference, he conveniently forgot to mention that the vast majority of polygamists in this country are not Muslims, are not recently arrived immigrants. They're actually based in Bountiful, BC, where 2 Mormon sects have been residing there for decades. And they're all Canadian residents. They're not immigrants.
ARUNA?
Well, 2 things. Violence against women is a global phenomenon. It crosses all cultural, religious, economic boundaries, and so domestic violence the same. So I agree with that. Okay, but how the violence against women is manifested is rooted in culture. Culture writes the script. Some cultures have female genital mutilation. Others don't. Some have child marriages, others don't. In UK, they have a 2-year-old who was forced into a marriage, who is a victim of forced marriage. So let me finish. So culturally rooted violence is part of what we bring with us. My father, my elders have done that, and I have been fighting against it. So what happens is, when we don't talk about culture, you start to do a risk assessment, you miss out the nuances of what the cultural impact is.
ARUNA, take a breath. Yeah, go ahead.
But ARUNA, my question is, and I've worked extensively, I've done a lot of research with, working together with social workers that work with immigrant women, and the thing that they've most told me is that they need resources, they need more money, they need more funds.
Absolutely.
They don't need slogans.
Absolutely.
And that's ultimately, at the end of the day, what will allow them to educate women, as you phrased earlier,
resources.
to explain. Yes, absolutely.
And the resources are
to define what domestic abuse is, for these women to be able to actually escape these abusive relationships. I don't need for Minister Alexander to pretend that he's taking a hard stance when with legislation that is simply redundant. We already have legislation against these things. If the legislation is not tight enough, then tighten it. Close the loopholes. But don't create something completely new, pretending that you're actually helping someone.
Ladies,
because I don't see it.
Okay, ladies. All right. So I know that FARRAH is trying to get in. ARUNA, respond very briefly, and then we can bring in FARRAH.
The resources are providing culturally based training to social workers who don't know what honor-based violence is, and they misinterpret their violence, what the women are facing, and they endanger their lives. We need money so they can be trained. We need money so the police officers can be trained. So resources are missing. The training is missing. 90% of the immigrant women go back to their abusers. There isn't a safe place for them to go and provide for their children. Yes, but if you don't know how to do proper risk assessment, the safety plans are flawed.
All right, FARRAH, what did you want to add?
So I think there's a couple things. So one, when we talk about culture, what are we talking about? Culture is not static. It's not, there's not one way to have a culture. I'm from India, so is ARUNA. We have a completely different way of living because we are different people. And so I think we need to check when we teach culture and we teach people how to talk about culture with clients, what are we actually teaching? We're teaching static old ways, and I'm not interested in that. Secondly, when we talk about it, Canada has a culture of violence. Canada was built on violence against Indigenous women. Canada continues that by, we had a whole conversation in Canada after the Jiangameshi piece about never been raped and never reported, where so many women talked about the fact that they didn't feel comfortable going forward because of systemic barriers. We need to change, and we need to fix a system that is built already on a broken system. We have a broken system to do with for survivors. We don't have a system in Canada for that.
I agree with that.
All right, and Jiangameshi was a very well-known Canadian personality, and we actually had a whole conversation about the fallout from allegations that happened to him.
my problem with focusing on honor-based killings, which in reality here, we also have legislation against honor-based killings. It's called legislation against murder, because we should be focusing on the killing part. And you know, it really baffled me that during the press conference, Minister Alexandra felt the need to bring up the Shafia case, which was a very prominent case here in Canada, for those listening from abroad, where a Muslim man from Afghanistan, I believe, orchestrated the murder of his daughters and one of his wives. Sure. And he brought it up as justification for such legislation being needed. The reality is the 3 members who orchestrated the murders are already serving time in prison for a first-degree murder, which means to me that the legislation already works. Focusing on honor-based killings and focusing on trying to kind of put the onus on recently arrived immigrants, to me is very ethnocentric. It's dangerous because it really plays on anti-immigrant sentiment.
Tula, let me get through this ethnocentric thing.
Sure.
Are you just saying it's racist?
It can be perceived as such, and I think it really focuses and it stokes the flames of anti-immigrant sentiment. It justifies certain people's sentiments that we're living, you know, in a multicultural society, and some people feel that they've already conceded too much. When in reality, if you look at the facts, Canada is a very difficult country to immigrate to, and under the Conservatives, it's becoming even more difficult.
Okay, ladies, just give me a pause for a moment so I can bring the community back in.
Well, Tula, the point that you just raised is one we just got a tweet on right now. This person says addressing violence against women through immigration restrictions is absurd and it's ineffective. Another person, Vespa, says, when I first heard of this proposed bill, I thought some of the things it would target could be good, but if we really examine it, Vespa says, it focuses on very specific things and it's very targeted at immigrants. FARRAH.
That's my biggest problem with it. Because if someone is not paying attention to the facts, or if your average Canadian voter doesn't realize that there's already legislation in place, you look at that press conference, you look at that grandstanding, zero tolerance for, you know, barbaric cultural practices, and it sounds like the Conservative government is taking such a hard stand on things. And in reality, we already have legislation. It's just slogans. It's just vote pandering.
And there are so many different ways of interpreting what the bill says, but for me, it says, when I witnessed an 80-year-old girl who had been circumcised and her genitals were swollen, this big and screaming.
Is not about female genital cutting,
so
I don't know why
it is.
It up.
That is a cultural practice. Forced marriage is a culture, and children's, you know, parents will tell you this is our culture, this is our religion.
So, ARUNA, I have 1 minute.
But we have legislation against this.
So it is.
All right, ladies, I'm just going to ask you all just to take a pause. So right at the end of the show, I don't want us to crash into the end of the show. This word barbaric, ARUNA, are you comfortable with that?
I wrote the word in my report. Because I think taking a teenage girl and forcing her into a life of slavery is forced marriage is barbaric.
And it's upsetting a lot of people. Are you comfortable with that?
I am very comfortable with that word because 18 years of barbaric life, yes, it should not happen to anybody else, Canadian or otherwise, anywhere in the world. It should not happen to anybody.
ARUNA PAPP is an advocate for women's rights. FARRAH Khan is a violence against women counsellor. Tula Drimonis is a freelance writer and editor. As you can hear, they're all about to have another conversation. We are taking that conversation we're about to have to stream.aljazeera.com. It is called The Post Show. #AJStream. Malika, you're still taking tweets?
Of course, using that hashtag.
She's still taking tweets. All right, so come to that post show with us. We look forward to seeing you there. Let me tell you about the next AJ Stream. Could playing a game like World of Warcraft train you to be a better citizen? We'll meet a group of gamers and hear their life lessons from the virtual world. That's in the next AJ Stream. In the meanwhile, we will see you at stream.aljazeera.com in the post show. Thanks for watching. Hello again. This is the Streams online post show. We're carrying on our discussion on a controversial bill in Canada that aims to eliminate polygamy and forced marriage among the immigrant community. Let me just read out the name of the bill: Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. So we ended our conversation in the main show with ARUNA telling us why Barbaric was absolutely relevant, unapologetic. What's our community saying, Malika?
Well, they're split on that.
Right.
We did get this Facebook comment in talking about the name, and this person wrote to us saying the phrase barbaric cultural practices appears to be a term that's deliberately used to infer a cultural superiority. It's to emphasize an us versus them difference. But Farrah, we also got this tweet. Now, this came in not too long ago. Randy says, if you're a victim of forced marriage, child marriage, FGM, female genital mutilation, I don't believe that you would care about the term barbaric. He says the terms don't matter, Farrah.
I do think the terms matter, actually. I work with survivors and actually do a lot of survivor-centric work. And when we do that, a lot of them speak to the idea that, know that I can love my family, my community, my culture, my religion, despite the violence that's happening within it. And so a lot of our work is actually, you can't just tell somebody that you have to be safe, you have to give up your whole family, community, culture. And the idea, too, when we label certain cultures as barbaric, it minimizes the real and persistent problem of violence against women in Canada. We need to expand the definition of violence against women to include these forms of violences and not make it something, just as one person said, an us versus them piece, because it's happening in Canada to Canadians. And so I think that's a big piece for me that I bring up. And I think we have to listen to survivors. I don't know if that's the number one thing for me that I learned and have heard from survivors in my years of work is that survivors need to be seen, heard, and believed. And that's what survivors are asking for. And I myself am a survivor of family violence. And the number one thing I wanted was not that my family to be criminalized, but I wanted people to recognize that it was happening in the home and to get help.
ARUNA?
There are particular kinds of violence or forms of violence that are rooted in culture and that are explained through culture, and culture has so many different definitions. There isn't just one, let me finish. There isn't just one way of explaining what is culture. Within the family, girls that are brought up in patriarchal societies such as mine, there are gender rules that they have to follow, and when they step out of it, then they are forced into marriages, they are killed, they are taken to the old country, and this is happening, and they are Canadian kids, and this is happening to them, and we have to be able to talk about these things and what is happening.
It happens in here too, ARUNA.
I'm talking about here. I'm talking about here.
What Robert Pickton did to over 26 women, we know of 26 women at least, that were killed by Robert Pickton. That was a barbaric act. The way you should know. ARUNA, I let you finish. You're just going to have to let me finish.
All right, so Farrah, before you get started, you introduce a person into this conversation that I'm sure Canadians will know and the rest of us will go.
I'm happy to.
Yeah,
I'm happy to go
this?
through Robert Pickton.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Robert Pickton, it was a multimillionaire pig farmer that was convicted in 2007 of second-degree murders of 6 women. He was also charged in the death of an additional 20 women. So, and this was a white man, a pig farmer, but we don't say that there's a culture of pig farmers that are all abusive towards women. So we need to go away from this idea that it's one community or in the other. We need to actually talk about it happening here, and that it's a culture of a global culture of patriarchy.
It was a white man.
Exactly.
Yes, it was a white man, but in honor-based cultures, it is parents who are killing their daughters. It's parents, uncles, mothers, grandfathers that are rooted in culture and honor-based violence. So it is a white man killing white women and he's psychotic, but it's not parent. Absolutely barbaric.
No,
absolutely barbaric. The difference is it's mom and dad that are killing their daughters and punishing their daughters, and that they relate to.
People do violence towards their children in Canada. We have child sexual abuse in Canada.
And the motive for that.
We have harm of children in Canada. And the motive always is the same across the board. mode. The motive is about power and control. That's what violence is about. And so when we're talking about community codes of conduct, abusers use anything at their availability to say, you're not following community code of conduct, so I'm going to rationalize my violence against you. And I'm speaking of that in domestic violence cases, and that's across culture, across religions. So I think we need to recognize that and not make these kind of blanketed statements that actually do more harm than good to clients.
All right, ladies, I know you can go back and forth for this for some time. Let me just interject for a moment. Malika.
Well, of course, because this is a pretty heated debate online, as heated as it is on our show today, I want to read one Facebook comment that we got from the other side. And this is Dustin, and he says, if you want to force your children into arranged marriages, do it somewhere else. We have freedom of choice here. And Tula, this is something that we saw a couple of places. There are also some tweets like this that referenced the idea that this is not a Canadian practice and these things are un-Canadian.
Against human rights.
This is exactly
Can you explain what that means?
The reason the bill was named zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices is exactly reactions like this that they're hoping for. The reason politicians use this kind of rhetoric is because it works. It panders to people, it panders to people's fears, it's fear-mongering at its very best. And people think they're actually taking a stance on something when they're not. They're offering no new legislation, no new solutions, no real funding as far as I know. It's basically just pandering to people's fears, creating this us versus them, and it's been used before. As a Quebecer and a Montrealer, I only remember too clearly when the political party in power at the time had come out last year with a bill for, what was it? It was a secularism bill for Quebec cultural values.
A topic we did a show on not too long ago.
How words are used matters. I can tell you as a writer, as an editor, language matters. And when you, these are very specific words that are thrown in there. And it's very important, as FARRAH said, that we need to not make blanket statements. You know, you can talk about honor-based killings, but they take place here every single day in North America. When a husband or a partner or a jilted partner kills his estranged wife because she left the marriage, that's an honor killing. The reason we don't call it an honor killing is because the two people involved probably are white and maybe pray like us and look like us. That's the only difference. And this is what I hate, that it really prays to this anti-immigrant sentiment, and it makes people who haven't really done their homework or taken the time to really look at the legislation think they're actually taking a stance and they're protecting these women when they're not. What's going on right now with the Conservatives, one thing that really bothers me is that the Conservatives have actually made it much more difficult for spouses that come from abroad. If they arrive here on a conditional a 2-year visa, and they need to, before they gain permanent status, they need to remain within that marriage. To me, that is dangerous because that actually makes these immigrant women more vulnerable to the system. Because if they happen to be in an abusive relationship and they want to walk away, they're afraid to leave because their two options are either to stay in an abusive relationship or risk deportation. What happens, and deportation is happening more and more under the Conservatives. So explain to me how they're actually helping these women right now, the most vulnerable of all women.
Honor killings are very different than domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And in my workshops, I'm going to talk about. Give me a minute.
They're not.
All right, so
ladies, parents were killing their daughters
because we're running out of time here. So
and because they're premeditated. They are premeditated against young women.
All right, so I like it when you talk to each other. When you talk to each other, do you answer each other? Okay. So Tula asked you, Aruna. Could you respond to that just very briefly, because we're running out of time, and I really do get your main points that you've all been making for the last 30 minutes. Tula, go ahead. What did you want to say to Aruna?
I specifically mentioned the 2-year conditional, probationary visa that women have to have in order when they come here married to another immigrant.
Yes.
And basically, I was saying, how does this new legislation, help these women? Help them. You keep repeating the fact that it does. It's going to help them. But since it's redundant legislation and it hasn't really targeted something specific, how do you see it helping them?
Well, first of all, we're going to educate the community about what the new laws are. We're going to educate the social workers, those who do the interviews. We're going to tell the women who come into Canada what the laws are and how they are protected, so they are prepared when these things happen. People who come into Canada do not expect to be beaten, do not expect to be abused. It happens here because they have come.
But this already exists. This already exists.
by Canadians.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And I've researched, and specifically talking about immigrants.
Well, I'm glad you have researched it. I have lived it for 30 years, so I am telling you.
I empathize and I understand, but
the point is, I have talked to hundreds of women.
I understand,
and I don't think the only expert.
All right, ladies, one at a time. Tula, I hear you. Farrah, you jump in the conversation now. Tula, you've made some really good points. Farrah, we want to share the conversation with you. What did you want to add briefly?
I think just a piece with this is that we cannot, when women come over to Canada, what Tula asked the question was really important, is that if our Canadian government is really interested in protecting women, they would talk about actually the fact that they wouldn't cut refugee health. They would actually look at not investing in services for women when they come to Canada. We've had a cut of immigrant women's services. So we actually need that to be the focus, not these kind of blanketed kind of bills that actually don't actually do the work that needs to be done in Canada. We need to actually commit to violence against women advocacy.
All right,
and I think we all agree with that.
All right, ladies. The number of refugee claims being accepted here has actually dropped 25% under the Conservatives.
Yes.
This is where it matters as far as I'm concerned. I'm not seeing any concrete action. I'm just seeing a lot of words and a lot of slogans.
All right, let me just add something here. This is from Kellie Leitch. She was speaking on Sun News quite recently. She's a Minister for Status of Women. A lot of critique about what the government is doing right now with this legislation. I just want you to hear how the government is framing it. Have a listen to Kellie Leitch here.
These cultural practices that are viewed as barbaric or actually limiting the rights, the human rights of women, are unacceptable here. And we will act to make sure that the women who choose to come to Canada, they're coming to Canada because they believe that their rights will be upheld, that we have a rule of law here that protects them.
Okay, so that is the voice from the government of Canada. Let me just end with our online community, see where they're sitting on this
Well, I'll
issue.
give you two, because there are people that agree with that sentiment that you just played. Mike on Facebook says, we need to remember that immigrants need to integrate into a new society, not recreate whatever it is that they fled. And on the other hand, on Twitter, Lamech says society actually needs a pragmatic and paradigm shift in thinking to stop violence against women, and legislation alone isn't the solution.
Wow. So when is this likely to happen? Do you think it will happen, this legislation, ARUNA?
Well, I'm hoping that it will happen. I don't know when it'll happen, but I hope it will happen. Yeah.
Okay. And Farrah?
Well, I don't want to see it happen, and but if it does happen, if they're thinking of going through, because it's going to go through Senate, which is interesting, it's not going first through the House of Commons, it's going to Senate.
Right.
I think there needs to be a lot of community consultations with experts and survivors to really change this. First, the name needs to go, and secondly, it needs to actually be listening to survivors when it's created.
Sure.
And then the other thing that we really want to name is when Kellie's saying that, I too want the government to end violence against women in Canada, but this is not the way to do it. We need them actually to have a national strategy to end violence against women. We actually need them to commit to ending violence against women and listening to survivors. And I think people keep talking about it being a watershed moment in Canada about violence against women with all the conversation that has been happening. So we need them actually to follow up with that. And when they say they're going to end this form of violence, they need to be ending all forms of violence and actually recognizing what is happening in our home country.
And as you can hear from the discussion we've had just today on this show, there's still a lot of debate to be had. Thank you to Farrah Khan, ARUNA PAPP and Tula Drimonis for being part of this discussion today. Meanwhile, moving on to the next AJ stream. Could playing a game like World of Warcraft train you to be a better citizen? We'll meet a group of gamers and hear their life lessons from the virtual world. Until then, I'll see you online.